December 18, 1944. The forest between Stavelot and Francorchamps, Belgium. 3 million gallons of American gasoline sat in 5-gallon jerry cans, stacked along 7 miles of frozen road cut through the Ardennes woods. It was the largest concentration of fuel on the European continent, enough to fill the tank of every panzer the Wehrmacht had left in the West, twice over. And in the early hours of that morning, a young quartermaster captain named Joseph Wilson received an order that made no sense on paper. Evacuate the depot. All of it. Right now. The problem was that Joachim Peiper's armored Kampfgruppe, Panthers, Tigers, half-tracks, 4,800 SS troops, had smashed through American lines 48 hours earlier and was now less than 3 miles away. Peiper had already found one American fuel dump at Bulge. His men had forced captured American soldiers at gunpoint to refuel German tanks, pouring American gasoline into German engines. 50,000 gallons, gone. But 50,000 gallons was a rounding error. Peiper had no idea what was sitting in the trees ahead of him. The depot he was about to drive past, without ever knowing it was there, held 60 times more fuel than the one he had just captured. Remember that number, 3 million gallons. Because it tells you something that no tactical map, no order of battle, no biography of any general can tell you. By December 1944, the American supply system had grown so vast that 3 million gallons of gasoline could sit in a Belgian forest, absent from German intelligence maps, watched over by nothing more than a quartermaster company. And it was not even one of the largest depots on the continent. The Germans had planned their entire Ardennes offensive around the hope of capturing fuel like this. The Wehrmacht did not have enough gasoline to reach its own objectives. The plan, signed by Hitler himself, assumed that German panzers would seize Allied supply depots along the way to Antwerp. Germany's last great gamble in the West was designed, from the first day, to run on stolen American gasoline. The most powerful military machine in Europe needed its enemy to provide the gas. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe and hit like. It helps these histories find the people who care about them. Now. Every German staff officer knew who George Patton was. They tracked his Third Army on situation maps with red pins. They studied his speed, his aggression, his habit of pushing ahead of his own supply lines. When Patton moved, phones rang at every German headquarters between the Meuse and the Rhine. But here is what most people have never heard. By late 1944, the German officers who actually understood what was happening, the intelligence analysts, the logistics specialists, the men who counted convoy manifests and read captured shipping documents, those officers had stopped worrying primarily about Patton. They were worried about the people who made Patton possible. The quartermasters, the port engineers, the truck drivers who ran convoys through the dark on roads they could not see, the supply officers who built harbors out of concrete in the open sea, the dispatchers who ran 6,000 trucks in a continuous loop across France for 82 straight days, the factory foremen back in Detroit and Richmond and Pittsburgh, who had quietly turned the largest civilian economy on Earth into something the German general staff had never encountered and could not find a word for. None of these people ever appeared in a single German intelligence briefing as a named threat. None of them carried a weapon that could knock out a panzer, and not one of their names was known to any German soldier in the field. That was the problem, because by the time Germany understood what these people had built, it was no longer a question of winning or losing battles. It was a question of how fast the war would end. This is the story of why, not the story of generals or tank duels, but the story of the system behind every battle. The machine that fed 11 million American soldiers, armed them, fueled them, clothed them, moved them across 2 oceans, and replaced every tank, every truck, every bullet the enemy destroyed, faster than the enemy could destroy them. It begins in a place where the German army did not expect to learn anything useful. A rocky pass in the Atlas Mountains of Tunisia in February of 1943, where Erwin Rommel's panzers rolled over an American force that had never seen combat, and in the wreckage, German officers found something they had not encountered in 3.5 years of war on 2 continents. Not a secret weapon, not a hidden plan. They found abundance. Supply dumps so large that veteran German soldiers, men who had fought across North Africa on a quarter of the rations they needed, walked through them without speaking. And what the Germans took from those dumps, 45 tons of ammunition, 50,000 gallons of fuel, hundreds of vehicles, was not even a meaningful fraction of what had been there the week before. It was the first time Germany looked behind the American army and saw the machine. And what Rommel wrote about it in his report, and what his superiors in Berlin chose to do with that report, is one of the most consequential intelligence failures of the entire war. February 20th, 1943, Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps had just done what German panzers did best. In 6 days, 2 veteran panzer divisions had torn through an American defensive line, scattered a corps that had never fought a battle, and pushed 30 miles into Allied-held territory. American losses were staggering. 300 killed, 3,000 wounded, 3,000 captured, 183 tanks gone, 512 trucks, 208 guns. The United States Army had just suffered what Omar Bradley would later call the worst performance in its entire history. And the German soldiers who advanced through those positions could not stop talking about what they found. Not the weapons, not the abandoned tanks. Those were expected. What stunned them was everything else. Canned food, not field rations, but actual canned meat, fruit, coffee, chocolate, cigarettes by the crate. Medical supplies in quantities that a German field hospital had not seen since 1941. Blankets, boots, rain gear, fuel in neat rows of jerry cans, more fuel than Rommel's entire army had received in the past month from across the Mediterranean. Think about that for a moment. The American force at Kasserine was green, disorganized, and badly led. They had been in North Africa for barely 3 months, and they had more supplies, more of everything, than the Afrika Korps had been given during 2 years of fighting across the desert. A German officer, and accounts vary on the name, but the story appears in multiple sources, is reported to have walked through one of the captured American depots near Tebessa and said nothing for several minutes. Then he turned to his adjutant and said roughly, "We cannot win this war, now." There is a detail about Kasserine that gets lost in the usual telling, and it matters more than the battle itself. Rommel's primary objective in attacking through the pass was not to destroy the American II Corps. It was not even to push the Allies back to Algeria. His primary objective, stated in his own proposal to Kesselring, was to capture the American supply base at Tebessa. He needed those supplies. His army was starving. Across the Mediterranean, Allied submarines and aircraft were sinking half of everything Germany and Italy tried to ship to North Africa. Rommel's divisions were receiving 20 to 40% of their planned rations, fuel, and ammunition. So here is the paradox that should have changed the war. Germany won the battle. Germany captured enormous quantities of American material, and in the act of capturing it, Germany revealed its own fatal weakness. It was so short on supplies that seizing enemy dumps had become an operational objective. Remember what Rommel said next, because it turns out that the Desert Fox, whatever his other flaws, understood something that almost no one else in the German command grasped in February of 1943. After the battle, Rommel wrote a report. In it, he acknowledged that American troops had been poorly coordinated and badly positioned. But then he added something that his superiors in Berlin should have underlined in red. The Americans, Rommel wrote, had recovered remarkably fast after the initial shock. Their artillery had been first class, their reserves had been grouped quickly to block the passes, and their ability to regroup under pressure was something he had not expected from an untested army. But the line that mattered most was not about the soldiers. It was about the supplies. Rommel had seen the supply chain behind Second Corps, and he knew what it meant. The Americans would be back. They would be back with more of everything. And next time, they would know how to fight. He was right about all of it. Within 3 weeks of Kasserine, Eisenhower replaced the failed Corps commander with George Patton. Within 2 months, the same American divisions that had been routed in February were pushing the Afrika Korps into a shrinking pocket around Tunis. By May, 250,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered, 80 times the number of Americans captured at Kasserine. And here is the part that should stop you cold. The supplies that Germany captured at Kasserine, those 45 tons of ammunition, those 50,000 gallons of fuel that seemed so staggering to men who had been fighting on scraps, were replaced within days. Not weeks, days. New convoys were already crossing the Atlantic before the last German tank had pulled back through the pass. The German army had won the battle, captured the depot, and used the supplies. And it made no difference, because the depot refilled itself. That fact, a supply system that regenerated faster than an enemy could damage it, was something the German military had never confronted. They had fought the French, who collapsed. They had fought the British, who endured, but could not outproduce them alone. They had fought the Soviets, who could match them in manpower but not in materiel, until Lend-Lease filled the gap. The Americans were something different, and the man most responsible for making them different was someone the German general's staff had never heard of, a 50-year-old Army engineer in Washington, D.C., who had never led troops in battle, who had spent the 1930s building airports and hiring the unemployed, and who, by the spring of 1943, quietly controlled the largest logistics operation in the history of the world. His name was Brehon Somervell, and what he had already built by the time Rommel's panzers rolled through Kasserine is the reason Rommel's victory didn't matter. Brehon Somervell, 50 years old, was an army engineer who had never heard a shot fired in anger since 1918. He had spent the Depression running the Works Progress Administration in New York City, building LaGuardia Airport, hiring 200,000 men, managing $10 million a month in public works. In March of 1942, George Marshall handed him a job that made LaGuardia look like a backyard project. Feed, arm, clothe, transport, and supply the entire United States Army. Everywhere. At once. The organization Somervell took over was called the Services of Supply, later renamed the Army Service Forces. On paper, it was a bureaucracy. In practice, it was the engine behind every American bullet, every American boot, every American tank that reached every battlefield on Earth. And Somervell ran it the way he had run the WPA, with a temper that terrified subordinates, a contempt for inefficiency that bordered on cruelty, and a simple conviction that logistics was not support. Logistics was the war. Here is what that conviction looked like in practice. In 1940, the year before Pearl Harbor, the United States produced 331 tanks. In 1943, 3 years later, American factories produced 29,497. That is not a typing error. Tank production increased by a factor of 89 in 36 months. But tanks were not even the main story. The number that should have kept every German general awake at night was a different one: 2 million trucks. The United States built more than 2 million military trucks during the war. Germany, which relied on horses for 80% of its army's transport, never came close to that figure. A single American infantry division had more motor vehicles than an entire German corps. And now pay close attention, because this next fact is the one that turns production numbers into something human. On the morning of November 8, 1942, the same month American troops were landing in North Africa for the first time, a man named Henry Kaiser stood on a platform at the Permanente Metals shipyard in Richmond, California, and watched his workers do something that shipbuilders said was impossible. Kaiser had never built a ship before the war. He was a dam builder, Hoover, Bonneville, Grand Coulee. When the Maritime Commission handed him contracts for cargo ships, the established shipyards laughed. Kaiser did not know port from starboard. He did not know a keel from a bulkhead. What he knew was assembly lines. Kaiser broke Liberty ships into prefabricated sections, 30,000 components per vessel, manufactured at factories across the country and trucked to the yard. He replaced riveting with welding. He hired women, hired African Americans, hired anyone who could hold a tool. When traditional builders took 230 days to complete a ship, Kaiser's yards did it in 45, then 39. Then the Oregon yard finished one in 13 days. Then Richmond answered with 7. And on that November morning, Kaiser's crew at Richmond laid the keel of the SS Robert E. Peary. 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes later, they launched a finished Liberty ship, a 441-foot cargo vessel that could carry 9,000 tons of supplies across an ocean, built in less time than it takes most people to paint a house. It was a stunt. Kaiser admitted that. You could not build ships at that pace every day. But the stunt told a story that no German propaganda ministry could answer. By 1943, American shipyards were launching 3 Liberty ships per day, 2,751 by war's end. Each one carried enough ammunition to supply a division for a month, or 2,800 jeeps, or 440 tanks. And this is where it gets important for our story. Because while Kaiser was launching ships in California, and General Motors was producing 854,000 trucks in Michigan, and 71 million rounds of small arms ammunition were rolling off production lines every single day. While all of this was happening, Germany was hitching artillery to horses, That is not an exaggeration. It is not metaphor. 80% of the Wehrmacht's motive power came from horses. Each German infantry division needed thousands of them. The army consumed more oats than oil. And Joseph Goebbels, understanding what this meant for morale, personally ordered that no newsreel footage of horse-drawn transport be shown in German cinemas. Only tanks, only trucks, only the illusion of a mechanized force. The illusion held inside Germany. It did not hold on the battlefield. And the men who saw through it first were not generals. They were German supply officers, the men responsible for getting ammunition from railheads to frontline units, who by 1943 were writing reports that read like pleas for help. They were losing the war not in the field, but in the depots, not in tactics, but in tonnage. Marshall, speaking after the war, said of Somervell, "If I went into control in another war, I would start looking for another General Somervell the very first thing I did. And so would anybody else who went through that struggle on this side." But here is the question that Somervell himself would have asked. What good is 2 million trucks if they are sitting in a factory in Michigan, and your army is fighting in France? What good is 9,000 tons of cargo on a Liberty ship if the ship is in the middle of the Atlantic, and your soldiers need the ammunition today? Production was only half the problem. The other half was delivery, moving everything Somervell built across an ocean, onto a hostile shore, and forward to an army advancing faster than anyone had planned for. And in the spring of 1944, the Allies attempted something that the German High Command had studied for years and concluded was flatly impossible. They built a port, in the open sea, from scratch, in 6 days. June 14th, 1944, 8 days after D-Day, the coastline off Arromanches, France. A German prisoner, captured during the fighting inland and marched back to the beach for transport to England, stood at the edge of the sand and stopped walking. His guards had to push him forward. He was not trying to escape. He was trying to understand what he was looking at. A harbor had appeared in the open sea. It had not been there a week ago. Nothing had been there a week ago except waves, mines, and the Atlantic Wall. Now there were concrete breakwaters the size of apartment buildings, sunk into the seabed in a curving line that created a sheltered bay where no bay existed. Steel pontoons stretched from the breakwaters to shore, forming piers wide enough for tanks to drive across. Ships, dozens of them, sat inside the artificial harbor, cranes swinging, trucks rolling off ramps, and straight onto the beach roads heading inland. The prisoner, according to one account, turned to the man next to him and asked a question in German that the guard did not understand. Another prisoner translated it later. He had asked, "How long did this take?" The answer was, 6 days. Here is why this moment matters more than it seems. For 4 years, the German High Command had studied the problem of invading across the English Channel, first as their own plan, Operation Sea Lion, and later as their defense against an Allied invasion. And for 4 years, one conclusion had remained constant across every German staff study. A major amphibious invasion of northern France was impossible without capturing an intact deep-water port, Cherbourg, Le Havre, one of the large harbors where cargo ships could dock, unload, and turn around. The Germans had planned accordingly. They fortified every port. They mined every approach. They prepared demolition charges on every crane and every quay. And when the Allies did come ashore at Normandy, on open beaches with no port, the German command assumed that the beachhead could be contained and starved of supplies before the Allies could capture Cherbourg. They were right about Cherbourg. When the Americans finally took it on June 27th, German engineers had demolished it so thoroughly that it took months to repair. Every crane destroyed, every dock mined, every channel blocked with sunken ships. They were wrong about everything else. Because the Allies did not need Cherbourg. They had brought their own port across the channel in pieces. 600,000 tons of prefabricated concrete and steel, towed by tugboats from England, assembled on the Norman coast in less than a week. 45,000 workers and 300 companies across Britain had spent a year building the components in secret. The project was codenamed Mulberry. Within 10 days of going operational, Mulberry was unloading more than 8,000 tons of cargo per day. Tanks, ammunition, fuel, food, medical supplies, replacement troops. By the end of July, the rate hit 20,000 tons per day. Over the 10 months that Mulberry B remained in service at Arromanches, 2.5 million men, 500,000 vehicles, and 4 million tons of supplies came ashore through a harbor that had not existed before D-Day. And then came the storm. On June 19th, 5 days after the harbors opened, The worst Channel storm in 40 years hit the Normandy coast. 32-knot winds, waves that tore concrete caissons from their moorings and smashed pontoons into wreckage. The American Mulberry at Omaha Beach, WWII, was destroyed beyond repair. Hundreds of landing craft and small vessels were wrecked on the beach. In any other army, this would have been a catastrophe. The supply plan was in ruins. The timetable was broken. The entire invasion was at risk of stalling on the shore. Here is what the Americans did. They did not wait for the harbor to be rebuilt. They cannibalized the wreckage of Mulberry A, used the parts to repair Mulberry B, and shifted their entire supply operation to direct beach unloading, using DUKWs, amphibious trucks that could swim from ship to shore and drive straight onto the roads. Ugly, loud, leaking vehicles that were never meant to carry the bulk of an invasion's logistics. They carried it anyway. By the end of June, despite losing half their artificial harbor capacity, Allied forces were landing 78% of their planned troop movements and 80% of their supplies. Not because the plan worked, because when the plan failed, the system improvised a new one. After the war, Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, the man who had managed the construction of the Atlantic Wall, was asked about the Mulberry harbors. His answer is one of the most quietly devastating assessments any German official ever made about the Allied war effort. To build our defenses, Speer said, we use 13 million cubic meters of concrete and 1.5 million tons of steel. 2 years of labor. A fortnight after the enemy landed, this entire effort was rendered worthless by an idea of simple genius. Speer was talking about engineering, but what he was really describing, without quite knowing it, was a difference in civilization. Germany built walls. America built systems. Walls can be bypassed. Systems adapt. And that system was about to be tested in a way no one had planned for. Because in the last week of July 1944, the American army broke out of Normandy and began racing across France so fast that even the greatest logistics operation in history could not keep up. Within weeks, Patton's Third Army would be screaming for fuel that did not exist. Supply lines would stretch to the breaking point, and someone would have to invent a solution from nothing in less than 2 days. The solution would be called the Red Ball Express, and the men who drove it were not the men anyone in the army had expected to save the war. July 25, 1944, Operation Cobra. After 7 weeks of grinding combat in the Normandy hedgerows, the American First Army punched a hole in the German line west of St. Lo. Within 48 hours, the hole became a flood. Armored columns poured through the gap and burst onto the open roads of central France. Patton's newly activated Third Army swung south, then east, then north, covering ground at a pace that stunned the Germans and terrified the supply officers behind him. Patton was advancing up to 75 miles in a single day, and every mile doubled the problem, because a supply truck leaving the beaches at Normandy now had to drive that distance forward, unload, and drive back empty, before it could carry another load. A round trip that had been 50 miles in July was 200 miles by mid-August, then 300, then 400. By the third week of August, the American armies were consuming 20,000 tons of supplies per day. The railroads were destroyed. Allied bombers had wrecked them before D-Day to keep the Germans from reinforcing Normandy. The ports were either in German hands or smashed beyond use. And every gallon of fuel, every box of ammunition, every tin of rations had to travel by truck from the beaches of Cherbourg to wherever Patton happened to be that morning. The greatest army in the world was about to stop, not because of the enemy, but because it could not feed itself. On August 21st, a group of American logistics officers sat down in a room and did not leave for 38 hours. Their task was to solve a problem that military textbooks said had no field solution: how to sustain an army that was moving faster than its own supply lines could stretch. Brigadier General Ewart Plank ran the session. Colonel Loren Ayers, a man his troops called Little Patton, was given the job of finding the trucks and the drivers. What they designed in that room was not elegant. It was not in any manual. It was a brute force improvisation built on one insight. If you could not shorten the distance, you could eliminate the downtime. They called it the Red Ball Express. 2 highways across France, one northbound, one southbound, were closed to all traffic except supply trucks. The northern route carried loaded vehicles east. The southern route carried empties back west. A continuous loop running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. No stops except to refuel. No speed limit that anyone actually obeyed. Convoys marked with red balls, the old railroad term for priority freight, had absolute right-of-way over everything. The trucks were 2.5-ton GMC Jimmies. The Army needed 6,000 of them immediately. Heirs pulled them from every unit that could spare a vehicle, and some that could not. Then came the question of drivers. 23,000 of them. The Army found them in the place it had always put the men it trusted least. 3 out of 4 Red Ball Express drivers were African American. Young men, most under 24, who had been drafted into a segregated army that believed they lacked the courage for combat. They had been assigned to quartermaster companies, port battalions, service units, loading crates, unloading ships, work that no one decorated and no one filmed. Now the entire Allied advance depended on them. James Rookard was 19. He had never driven a truck before the Army. On his first night on the Red Ball route, he drove with blackout headlights, slitted covers the men called cat eyes, that reduced visibility to almost nothing. No road signs, no street lights. The windshield folded down to keep glass glare from drawing German artillery. Mud so thick it locked the brakes. And the knowledge that Germans were planting mines on the roads at night and stringing piano wire across at neck height. The jeeps at the front of each convoy carried angle iron hooks welded to the hood, wire catchers, so the driver would not be decapitated. Rookard drove anyway. They all did. On August 29th, 4 days after the Express began, 132 truck companies put 5,958 vehicles on the road and delivered 12,342 tons of supplies to forward depots. It was the single highest daily total of the entire operation, and it was never matched again in the next 14 weeks. The Red Ball Express had reached its peak before most people in America had heard its name. Over 82 days, those trucks moved 412,000 tons of fuel, ammunition, food, and medical supplies from the coast to the front. Patton, a man not known for gratitude, said afterward that the 2.5-ton truck was America's most valuable weapon. Eisenhower's own son, Colonel John Eisenhower, wrote that without the Red Ball truck drivers, the advance across France could not have been made. A 5th Armored Division tank driver put it more simply. If it was not for the Red Ball, we could not have moved. They were all black drivers, and they delivered in the heat of combat. We would be sitting in our tanks praying for them to come up. Time magazine called it the miracle of supply, and wrote that it was begotten of a people accustomed to great spaces, transcontinental railways, nationwide trucking chains, endless roads, and millions of automobiles, a tradition the Germans have never really understood. That last phrase is the one to hold on to, a tradition the Germans never understood. Because while 23,000 Americans were driving through the dark to keep Patton moving, German intelligence was watching, and slowly, painfully, beginning to grasp what they were actually fighting. What they concluded would change the way they thought about the war. And what one German field marshal said to a British historian about it, years later, remains one of the most honest admissions any defeated commander has ever made. Sometime in the summer of 1944, the exact date is not recorded, but the story appears in multiple accounts. A column of German prisoners was being marched along a road in Normandy toward a temporary holding area near the coast. The men were tired, dirty, and quiet. Most had fought on the Eastern Front before being transferred west. They had seen Soviet convoys. They had seen British supply lines. They thought they understood what a modern army looked like. Then the American trucks started passing. First a dozen, then 50, then a stream that did not stop. GMC Jimmies, Dodge cargo haulers, fuel tankers, ambulances, jeeps towing trailers, half-tracks loaded with ammunition crates, and behind them, more trucks, bumper to bumper, filling the road in both directions as far as anyone could see. Every vehicle brand new, every vehicle running. No breakdowns on the shoulder, no horses. One of the prisoners turned to a guard and asked a question that the guard found so strange he remembered it years later. "Where are the horses?" The guard did not understand. There were no horses. There had never been horses. The American Army did not use horses. It had eliminated horse cavalry entirely in 1942. But the German soldier was not making a joke. He was asking because he did not know how an army could function without them. That question, "Where are the horses?" is the crack in the wall through which the entire German defeat becomes visible. Because the truth about the Wehrmacht, the truth that Goebbels spent the entire war hiding, was this. 80% of the German army's transport power came from horses. Not trucks, not half-tracks, horses. Every standard infantry division, and infantry divisions made up the vast bulk of the German army, required thousands of horses to pull its artillery, haul its supplies, and move its equipment. The army consumed more oats than gasoline. More veterinarians served in the Wehrmacht than mechanics. This was not a failure of planning, it was a failure of capacity. Germany did not have the industrial base to motorize its army. It did not have the oil, it did not have the rubber, and it did not have the culture. That last point is the one nobody talks about, and it matters more than all the production statistics combined. In the German army, logistics was a dead end. Supply officers were not respected. They were not promoted. They were viewed, in the words of one post-war analysis, as men who should not impede operations. The entire German military philosophy, built in the years between the wars, was based on speed, maneuver, and tactical brilliance. Operations came first. Logistics was an afterthought. The supply officers would figure it out after the panzers had already moved. This worked in France in 1940, where the distances were short and the campaign was over in 6 weeks. It worked in the opening months of Barbarossa, where captured Soviet supplies helped fill the gaps. It stopped working the moment the war became long, the distances became vast, and the enemy could replace its losses faster than Germany could inflict them. The American army was built on the opposite principle. Logistics was not support. Logistics was strategy. You did not plan a campaign and then figure out how to supply it. You figured out what you could supply, and then you planned the campaign around that. Every American offensive, from Torch to Overlord to the Rhine crossings, began with a logistics estimate. How many tons per day? How many trucks? How many ship berths? If the numbers did not work, the offensive did not happen. Eisenhower understood this. Marshall understood it. Somerville had staked his career on it. And the German generals, by 1944, were beginning to understand it too, but from the wrong side. After the war, the British military historian Basil Liddell Hart traveled to prisoner of war camps across Western Germany and interviewed dozens of senior Wehrmacht officers. He spoke with field marshals, corps commanders, panzer division leaders, men who had fought on every front. He asked them all the same questions. What decided the war? Where did Germany lose? The answers, collected in a book Liddell Hart published in 1948, form a pattern so consistent it reads like a single voice. The generals blamed Hitler. They blamed the weather. They blamed the two-front war. But when pressed for specifics, when Liddell Hart asked what, concretely, they could not overcome, the word that came up again and again was not tanks or planes or soldiers. It was supply, materiel, the unending flow of American equipment that arrived faster than it could be destroyed. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the most senior German commander in the West, the man who had planned the original Ardennes breakthrough in 1940 and now presided over its collapse, told Liddell Hart 3 things had defeated Germany: Allied air supremacy, the force of Allied logistics, and the constraint on German movement that these 2 factors created together. Not Patton, not Montgomery, not any general by name. Air power and supply, the sky and the trucks. And in December of 1944, von Rundstedt was given one final chance to test whether German tactical genius could overcome American logistical dominance. Hitler handed him the plan personally, a massive armored thrust through the Ardennes, the same route that had broken France in 1940, aimed at the port of Antwerp, the beating heart of the Allied supply system. Cut the supply line, capture the port, split the Allied armies in half, win the war. There was only one problem. The German army did not have enough fuel to get there, and the plan's own architects knew it. The plan was called Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. It was Hitler's idea. His generals, von Rundstedt included, believed it was too ambitious. They proposed a smaller offensive. Hitler overruled them. 25 divisions, 1,200 tanks, 250,000 men. The attack would hit a thinly held sector of the American line in the Ardennes forest of Belgium, drive 60 miles to the Meuse River, then swing north to capture Antwerp, the port through which 40,000 tons of Allied supplies flowed every day. Seize Antwerp, and the Allied armies would starve. But the plan had a number in it that its own authors could not solve. The German army needed 5 million gallons of fuel to reach Antwerp. It had 2.5 million, half of what it needed. The shortfall was not a miscalculation. It was acknowledged in the planning documents. The solution, written into the operational order as though it were a routine logistics note, was that German spearheads would capture American fuel depots along the route. Hold that. Germany's final offensive of the war, the last strategic gamble of the Third Reich, was built on the assumption that the enemy would provide the gasoline. If you want to understand why American logistics officers scared the German command more than Patton ever did, this is the fact that answers the question. Not because the plan was desperate, but because by December 1944, stealing American fuel was the only way Germany could still wage mobile war. The Wehrmacht had run so low on its own resources that it literally could not attack without first robbing the army it was attacking. The spearhead of the assault was the same man from the opening of this story, Joachim Peiper, 30 years old, commanding Kampfgruppe Peiper, the most powerful armored battle group in the 6th Panzer Army. Peiper's mission was speed. Break through the American line, seize bridges over the Meuse, and do not stop for anything. He launched on December 16th. His column hit the American 99th Infantry Division and pushed through. By the morning of the 17th, his panzers had overrun Honsfeld and reached Boulingen, where they found a small American fuel dump, 50,000 gallons. His crews forced American prisoners to pour the gasoline into German tanks, while the rest of the column refueled and pressed west. 50,000 gallons kept the spearhead moving, but Peiper's tanks burned fuel at a ferocious rate. A King Tiger consumed 2 gallons per mile on a paved road, more in mud or snow, and the 50,000 gallons would not last the day. He needed more. The entire plan needed more, and more was right there, waiting. The depot between Stavelot and Francorchamps, the one from the beginning of this story, sat just off Peiper's route. 1,115,000 gallons at Depot Number 3 alone. Combined with the adjacent dumps, more than 3 million gallons, enough to fuel Peiper's entire Panzer Army to Antwerp and back. It was the single most important piece of real estate on the Western Front that week, and German intelligence did not know it existed. Peiper drove through Stavelot on the morning of December 18th. He turned west toward Trois Ponts, looking for a bridge. The fuel dump was a few hundred yards north of the road he was on. He never turned north. Behind him, American engineers from the 291st Combat Engineer Battalion, under Captain Lloyd Sheets, had been setting roadblocks near the river since before dawn. And at the fuel depot itself, a small group of Belgian soldiers attached to the 1st U.S. Army, men from the 5th Belgian Fusilier Battalion, were preparing to do the only thing left to do. Robert Lemaire was one of 10 volunteers. Their lieutenant asked for them, and Lemaire stepped off the truck without hesitating. Their mission was to destroy the fuel before the Germans could take it. They tried shooting tracer rounds from a Bren gun into the jerry cans. The tracers did not ignite the gasoline, so they did it by hand, bayoneting the cans, spreading fuel across the road and across the stacked rows of containers, and lighting it with matches. The fire spread instantly. A wall of flame ran for 7 miles through the forest, 124,000 gallons burning at once. The road became impassable. The smoke rose high enough to be seen for miles. Peiper, already west of Stavelot and fighting for bridges at Trois Ponts, did not know what he had missed. The engineers at Trois Ponts blew the bridges in front of him. He turned north toward La Glaise, looking for another crossing. American paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne closed in from the west. His supply line through Stavelot was cut when American forces retook the town behind him. By December 23rd, Peiper's Kampfgruppe was surrounded. No fuel, no ammunition resupply. An attempted German airdrop failed. Most of the supplies landed outside his perimeter. On Christmas Eve, Peiper ordered his men to abandon every vehicle, every Panther, every Tiger, every half-track, and escape east on foot through the woods. The most powerful armored spearhead Germany could assemble in December of 1944 ended not with a battle, but with men walking away from machines they could no longer move. We began with a fuel depot. We began with 3 million gallons sitting in a forest. And now you know what that scene meant, not just for one battle group, but for the war. Germany's last offensive did not fail because Patton counterattacked from the south, although he did. It did not fail because of the stubborn American defense at Bastogne, although that mattered. It failed because Germany could not fuel its own war. And the people who made that true, the people who filled those depots, who drove those trucks, who built those harbors, who launched those ships, were not generals. They were the men Germany never learned to fear until there was nothing left to do about it. There is one thing left to tell, and it is quiet. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. And in the months that followed, the men who had built the machine went home, most of them into a silence that lasted the rest of their lives. Brehon Somervell retired from the army in April of 1946. He moved to Florida, then took a job as president of Koppers, a coal and chemical company in Pittsburgh. He never wrote a memoir. He never gave a famous interview. When he died on February 13, 1955, at the age of 62, the Washington Post called him one of the ablest officers the United States Army has produced. Most Americans had never heard his name. Most still have not. Henry Kaiser closed his shipyards and turned to other things: aluminum, steel, automobiles, and a healthcare system for his workers that became Kaiser Permanente, today one of the largest medical networks in the country. The man who had built 27% of all American wartime ships, who had launched a Liberty ship in 4 days, who had employed hundreds of thousands of workers that no one else would hire. That man is remembered, when he is remembered at all, for hospitals, not for the ocean he crossed with cargo. James Rookard, the 19-year-old Red Ball Express driver, who had steered a 2.5-ton truck through the dark on roads he could not see, went home to Ohio. He became a city truck driver in Cleveland. He drove for decades. He retired in 1986. When he talked about the war, his worst memory was always the same: trucks getting blown up on the road ahead of him and driving forward anyway because the tanks needed what he was carrying. Robert Lemaire, the Belgian volunteer who had bayoneted jerry cans and lit a wall of fire to keep 3 million gallons out of German hands, went back to his life in Belgium. He did not speak about Stavelot publicly for many years. When he finally did, he said, "We just did our job." Joachim Peiper, the man who had raced through the Ardennes searching for American gasoline, was convicted of war crimes for the massacre of American prisoners near Malmedy. His death sentence was eventually commuted. He was released in 1956. He moved to a village in France, where in 1976, his house was firebombed in the night. He died in the fire. He was 61. The forest between Stavelot and Francorchamps is quiet now. The road where 3 million gallons of fuel once sat in 5-gallon cans is a narrow 2-lane highway through the trees. There are no markers, no monuments, nothing to tell a driver passing through that this was the place where Germany's last offensive came closest to the thing it needed most, and missed it. That is the story of American logistics in the Second World War. Not a story of generals, not a story of battles, a story of truck drivers and engineers and factory workers and quartermasters, people who never fired a shot that made the news, who never stood on a stage, who never appeared in a single German intelligence briefing by name. And yet they were the ones Germany could not defeat. Patton was dangerous. The German command understood Patton. They had studied aggressive commanders before. They knew how to slow an armored thrust, deny the bridges, hold the crossroads, trade space for time, wait for the supply lines to stretch until the advance outran its own fuel. They had done it on the Eastern Front. They could do it in France. But you cannot outmaneuver a system that replaces everything you destroy. You cannot trade space for time against an enemy who builds ports in the open sea, drives 6,000 trucks through the night, and launches a cargo ship every 10 hours. You cannot fight a war of attrition when your enemy produces 2 million trucks, and your army moves on horseback. That is why American logistics officers scared Germany more than Patton. Patton could be stopped. He proved it himself. His tank sat idle for days in September of 1944, out of gas. But the system behind him never stopped. It adapted. It improvised. It found 23,000 drivers in 48 hours. It built a harbor in 6 days. It replaced everything Kasserine cost within a week. And it filled a forest in Belgium with more fuel than the entire German army possessed, and then burned it rather than let the enemy have a single gallon. The men who built that system did not win the war alone. But the war could not have been won without them. And the enemy, the one that mattered, the one that had conquered Europe, knew it before anyone else did. They just could not do anything about it. Thank you for staying with this story for nearly an hour. If it meant something to you, a like goes a long way. It is the single biggest thing that helps a video like this reach other people who care about these histories. If you are not subscribed yet, now is a good time, and turn on the bell so you never miss a new one. I would love to know where you are watching from today. And if someone in your family served in the Second World War, a parent, a grandparent, an uncle, anyone, tell their story in the comments. Even a name and a unit is enough. These stories deserve to be remembered, and this is a place where people will read them.